friends, welcome to the series which we are doing on issues in World History 1, the 20th century. And in the earlier lecture on the Second World War, we talked about some of the causes of the Second World War, that how these causes led to the war. In the course of discussion in today's lecture, we will try to bring about the other aspects which were related to the Second World War. We talked about how some kind of a new order of the world emerged after the Second World War, where USA and USSR emerged as the two most important countries, and the balance of power in that sense from Europe to America and USSR shifted in that sense, that how Europe was no longer the most important region where power was located. And we also talked about the various factors for the war, the Treaty of Versailles, the way it was being imposed on Germany, and the war guilt clause definitely played an important role during that time. And we also talked about the failure of the League of Nations to contain the war, and the situation of the Great Depression, where we find that how the various nations of Europe, they got affected due to the Great Depression, and how it created some kind of political instability or unemployment and the decline in the purchasing power of the people. All of this kind of situation was created in many countries of Europe. And also we find the rise of the Japanese militarism during this time, where how it occupied Manchuria and engaged itself in war with China, and finally attacking attacking USA at the Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941. So we see that how this was an important concern, and we also talked about the ideological issues, where we find that one was the ideals which were associated with the capitalist tendencies, and the other USSR, which was engaging on all the socialist kind of ideas. But we find that when you tend to see the ideological differences between the Nazis and fascists together, in comparison with the communists, those who were there in Russia, we find that both of them, they were dictatorships in that sense. The communists in Russia were behaving in the similar manner the way dictators were, as the case was in fascism, where Italy, Germany, Japan, Spain, Portugal. And we find that the kind of situation which was being created at that time, and there was some kind of feeling among some of the influential sections in Britain and France that a stronger Germany would operate as a safeguard against the spread of communism. So this kind of an appeasement policy which was followed by Britain and France, where they felt that a stronger Germany would act as some kind of a barrier against the rising power of USSR, which was there in terms of the communist principles, and how the capitalist world, Britain and France, also was not in favor of any government in their own countries which was of the socialist tilt. And scholars, they have also talked about that how Hitler was responsible for the war, and Stephen James Lee has referred to the early stages of the World War as the Hitler's War, and how Hitler in a way aimed to make Germany as a great power again, and he wanted to restore the lost pride of Germany. And he felt that how he could do it by destroying the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, and strengthening the armed forces, regaining the lost territories like Saar and the Polish corridor, and bringing all Germans within the Reich, especially annexing Austria and the annexation of territory from Czechoslovakia and Poland, both of which had huge German minorities as a consequence of the Versailles settlement. So we find that Hitler believed that how he could in a way destroy this treaty, how the armed forces, they could be strengthened by recruiting more and more soldiers, and or purchasing the weapons and making the weapons. And we also see that how he wanted to seek the lost territories like Saar and the Polish corridors, and how the Germans, they could be brought together in the Reich by annexing Austria. So, we see the period of Hitler as the Third Reich or the Third Empire, and once Hitler assumes power, then we find that he wanted to have more and more areas for Germany, because he felt that the policy of Anschluss. Anschluss was the union with Austria, where they will be able to secure more resources for themselves, and the German population could also be sent to these regions. So, not only Austria, we find that this kind of a policy was followed by the Germans and the Nazis in respect to other regions as well. And historians, many of them, they have argued that the annexations were just the beginning of the grander designs of conquering the whole of Poland and Czechoslovakia, and by the annexation of Russia as far east as the Ural mountains. So, we find that how these kinds of annexations, where we find that Germany had this kind of a design, that he wanted to conquer both the complete regions of Poland as well as Czechoslovakia, and how Russia was also to be annexed. So, Hitler would secure more areas for Germany. This is what his idea was, Lebensraum, or the living space, and this Lebensraum would give food for the Germans and a territory in which the excess German population could reside as well, largely in the Eastern Europe. And historians like A.J.P. Taylor, they have argued that Hitler never wanted a major war and was only prepared for a limited war against Poland. So, scholars, they have different or divergent kind of ideas with regard to the designs of Hitler, and Taylor, for example, talks about that how Hitler was not interested in a big war or a major war, and he only wanted some kind of a limited war with Poland. But whatever might have been his long term intentions, we find that Hitler was initially successful in his foreign policy, the way he withdrew Germany from the World Disarmament Conference and from the League of Nations, and he also signed a 10-year non-aggression pact with the Poles in January 1934. So, we find that Hitler was working on the kind of principles in which he believed, and his foreign policy measures were also designed keeping in mind the lost glory of Germany. And he also felt that how the Treaty of Versailles was in a way discriminatory towards the Germans, and it was not to be followed. And at the same time, we find that he also was trying or signing pacts with other nations as well, so as to see, or in a way take a decision at a later time and contain the situation at that point of time when he was engaged in these kinds of pacts. And we find that Hitler also secured Saar in January 1935 after a plebiscite, and he reintroduced conscription and defied limits introduced in the settlement, Versailles settlement, with regard to the number of forces to be maintained by Germany. So, we see that Hitler wanted to secure more and more areas for Germany, and he was also interested in terms of increasing the armed forces, and at the same time he also reintroduced conscription as well, because with conscription he would be able to secure the services of so many young men and women, those who will be sent in terms of military services. And he defied these the kind of limits which were introduced in the Versailles settlement with regard to the number of forces which were to be maintained by Germany, because we find that how the Versailles settlement restricted the number of people which will be there in the German army, German armed forces. So, he felt that how through introducing conscription, more young men, they will be there in the army, because they will be trained, and when they will be trained they could be recruited at a very short notice. So, that was one of his ideas. So if he could not directly increase the number of forces through conscriptions, he could have the services of the trained men. So whenever these trained men are required, they can be recruited in the army. And we also see that how Hitler also sent forces into the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland, because he wanted to again secure it back. And in March 1936 he did it, and later again in 1936 he strengthened the German position by signing the Rome-Berlin Axis with Mussolini's Italy, and by signing the anti-Comintern Pact with Japan, also joined by Italy in 1937. So we find that how Hitler was in a way engaged in a series of developments where he was trying to secure support of other nations, and how other nations, they were also having various kinds of pacts with Hitler. And so this resulted in some kind of close relations with other nations. And as I told you earlier, that he was ready to annex Austria, which he did as well in 1938, and how Anschluss, a term which was used to denote the union between Germany and Austria, also became a reality in that sense. And so Hitler in a way violated various provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, and it was also due to the fact that the policy of appeasement which was followed by the allied nations, for example Britain and France, both of them they in a way did not pay that kind of an attention which was required at point of time, and they felt that Hitler over a period of time may become docile, or also because of the fact that they did not want that the Russians or Russia as a communist state should have some kind of a more authority or power. So they wanted to in a way support Germany in that sense, that Germany rises as a power, as a balance against the Russians. So this kind of a policy which was followed by these countries where they wanted to avoid war with the aggressive countries like Germany, Italy and Japan, by in a way agreeing to their demands, which was also not a reasonable kind of a thing which was done by them. So we find that how on the one hand neither Britain nor France, they intervened in the Spanish Civil War, and we find on the other hand Germany and Italy, both of them, they actively supported General Franco of Spain. So General Franco, who again was a dictator, was supported by Germany and Italy, and on the other hand we find that Britain and France, they did not take much interest in this development as well. So we realize that when Hitler engaged in Anschluss, when Germany was able to occupy Austria in 1938, and then Britain and France, they protested at this kind of a situation. And but many in Britain, they also viewed it as natural union of one German group to another as well. So despite any kind of a protest as well, we do not see that any kind of an active measure was taken by Britain and France at this time. And this kind of an appeasement policy did not bear fruit for the allied nations, because finally the way they were following this policy to avoid the war, but finally the war happened. And when you see the situation in Munich in September 1938, where Britain and France, they were very anxious to avoid the war, and they presented Sudetenland to Hitler, and Hitler along with Italy, Britain and France guaranteed the remainder of Czechoslovakia. But despite this, despite what happened in Munich, we find the thirst of Hitler for acquiring more territory could not be quenched, and he finally invaded Czechoslovakia, or rest of the Czechoslovakia was occupied by him in March 1939. So despite giving assurances, we find that Hitler did not adhere to these kinds of assurances which were given by him, and his quench for securing more and more territories could not be satisfied, and we find that at different points of time he occupied more territories as than the what he demanded at the initial stage. And we see that this situation continues in 1939 as well, and when Hitler makes a demand to return Danzig and a road and a railway across the corridor in April 1939, and we find that Danzig was largely German speaking, yet the German demand for it signaled that they were only a lead up to attack. So that way we find that Hitler was trying to get more and more areas for Germany, and we also see that Hitler was also engaged with other countries, signing various kinds of pact, where he signed a non-aggression pact with USSR, in which the partition of Poland between USSR and Germany was agreed upon. So that was done in August 1939, where they decide to partition Poland between them, and Hitler also felt this kind of a need, that when Russia would be neutral, it would not be possible for Britain and France to risk interference in Poland. And Hitler's troops, they invaded Poland on 1st September 1939, and we find that England declared war on Germany, and thereafter France also declared war on Germany on 2nd and 3rd September 1939 respectively. So that way it also happens. So that was the kind of a situation in which Hitler was engaged, in which the other nations of Europe, especially Britain and France, which were the dominant nations, and how both these nations, they were also not taking any concrete steps at that point of time. They were also trying to appease Hitler, so that any kind of an avoidance of war happens, and it was also being talked about that any international body at that point of time, if it would have been a strong body, which was not the case with the League of Nations, where we find that how League of Nations, which had this kind of a responsibility to maintain peace in the world, proved to be a failure in dealing with a number of issues at that point of time. And the failure of the League of Nations to contain the situation led to the Second World War. And this was evident in some of the earlier instances as well, because the occupation of Poland was not an isolated incident. Even earlier we find that League was not was in any situation in terms of checking Japan's occupation of Manchuria, or Italy's annexation of Abyssinia, and Germany's occupation of Czechoslovakia and Austria. So League did not do anything when all these kinds of activities, they were being carried out, all these areas, they were being annexed by the different dictatorial powers. So in that sense we find that the failure of an international body to control and contain the situation at that point of time was another important factor which could have in a way created a situation where war could have been avoided. Another important aspect which one has to look at when one is talking about the Second World War, again related to the First World War, as we talked about the Treaty of Versailles, was in the framework of the irrational distribution of the territories by the victors after the First World War. So how the victors as Versailles, they distributed these kinds of areas which are with them, and the people belonging to a race and culture, they were kept under the authority of a country that possessed a completely different culture. So that was one of the most irrational things which we find, that how people, those who were from one race and culture, they were under a country which had a different culture, and these people, they were making all sorts of demands to join their racial stock, and the balkanization of the southeastern Europe continued swiftly, and in the recently established states were included German minorities, a reason which accounted for German belligerence in future. And when you talk about the Second World War, most of the times the kind of questions which are raised, that who should be held responsible for the war, whether Germany or Italy, they were responsible for war, or the sole kind of a blame in terms of starting the war and engaging other nations in the war should go to Germany. And sometimes historians, they also talked about that how the appeasement policy followed by Britain and France was equally responsible for the Second World War. So various scholars, those who belong to the different historiographical schools and their own viewpoints which are there, they have tried to in a way see the situation and have argued that different nations at different points of time, they were responsible for the war, and how the individuals in these countries, how they were behaving during this time, they also led to a situation of war. And scholars like Martin Gilbert, he has suggested that the Hitler aimed to eradicate the disgrace of defeat in the First World War, for the only antidote to defeat in one war is victory in the next. So this kind of an argument where Hitler is arguing that how the disgrace of the earlier war or the First World War could be erased by winning the next war, and this was taken up by the masses, those who were in Germany, and Nazism as a political philosophy was also very popular among the German masses. We find that how Hitler's ideas, they were taken up by the Nazis and the general masses, and some kind of a mass hysteria could be seen in the rallies of Hitler. So they also felt that Germany was capable to secure the lost glory, and at the same time the people in Germany, they felt that how they had been wronged in the First World War, that the way they were being treated, how they were being blamed for the First World War through the war guilt clause, and the kind of restrictions which are being placed on Germany through the Treaty of Versailles. None of them, they were being acceptable to the Germans, and Hitler mobilized this public opinion in his favor, that once he is being given this kind of an authority, and the kind of measures which will be taken by the Nazi party, all these measures will in a way help Germany restore its privileged place among the great nations of the world. And scholars, they have this kind of a divided opinion as well. Trevor Roper, he argues that the Hitler planned a major war right from the beginning, and he hated communism and desired to control it. So scholars, they have also in a way argued that Hitler planned a war, and he hated communism, and he wanted to control Germany and wanted to in a way eliminate communism as an ideological policy which was there in various countries, and he felt that this could only be realized by a major war, and the devastation of Poland was a necessary preliminary to the assault on USSR. So Hitler, scholars, they have argued that Hitler believed in this kind of an idea or ideology where he had to eliminate Poland so as to take the war to USSR, and the non-aggression pact with USSR was only to lull the Russian suspicions and maintaining her neutrality till Poland had been captured. So he was also trying for the various kind of tactics, and these tactics definitely would help him cement his position and the position of Germany, and later when he is able to achieve one objective, then he will go to another objective. So this kind of an argument was also put forward, and Hitler's texts like Mein Kampf, My Struggle, and Jutisberg, another book which was written by him, the second book, they have been in a way cited as various kinds of evidences for the theory which has been cited from the statements in his book. And they were apart from Mein Kampf, Hausbach memorandum was another one. This was some kind of a summary which was prepared by Hitler's adjutant Colonel Hausbach of a meeting held in November 1937, at which Hitler described his strategy to to his army officers. So, we find that various kinds of evidences, they have been in a way given, they have been cited, because of which we find that the kind of policy which Hitler wanted to follow was already there in the various texts which were written by him, or the various evidences which were available in which Hitler had participated. So, we will continue further, we will talk about some other aspects of the Second World War in our next lecture. Thank you very much.